Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop, and today I have got some special guests for you. Not just one, but three special guests from a company known as Eventide. Eventide has been around for more than 50 years, making some of the most forward-looking effects in the business. They practically invented the world of multi-effects, in my humble opinion, back in the 1970s, and have designed what I think is a groundbreaking EQ called SplitEQ. This is the newest in their line of structural effects. And the structural effects line from Eventide does something that's never been done before. This is separating the transient part of your signal from the sustained part of your signal, so you can manipulate the two of them independently. The first plugin they came out with in this line is called Fission, and it does things like compression and delay and reverb, and allows you to get all sorts of interesting effects that you never could do before. Eventide has been in business for, 50 years now, more than that, and has been pushing the envelope, I think, on what effects can do for that entire period of time. And the structural effects line is no different. But the latest iteration that you guys have out now is called SplitEQ. And SplitEQ is about EQing the sustain and the transient parts of the signal separately. And I think it can be used for more kinds of maybe surgical and corrective processing as well as effects. I'm really excited to try this thing out. We're going to be doing a demo video, putting this through its paces. Before we do, I want to have a conversation with these guys to figure out where this thing came from, what it's good for, why make it, and a whole bunch more. And we'll take a look at it together and get a quick synopsis. You can try out this plugin for yourself. Go to eventideaudio.com to get a free trial. I want to start the conversation off. We've got three great guys here. Tony Agnello, he's been here at Eventide for almost as long as Eventide's been around. He'll be here 50 years coming up pretty soon. Peter McCulloch, who is one of the engineers and programmers who helps implement these things, and then Russell, who helps work in the development side of things, kind of dreaming up some of these new plugins and figuring out what they should do. Russell, I want to ask you first, if you don't mind, where did the idea for this whole structural effects line come from? It just hasn't been done before.
Well, we hired a researcher about 2015, 2016, and we wanted to, know what he could work on. So we looked at all the things he had done in his past theses and stuff like that. And he had done a lot of work on something called morphological component analysis.
That sounds very fancy.
Right. So this is mostly an idea from image processing, where you can separate a signal or an image based on morphology. So a good example would be you have an image with some hard edges and some soft color saturation. You could turn that into two images, one that has the hard edges and one that has kind of all the soft colors and saturation and stuff like that, right? We thought, well, what if we could do this with audio?
Right.
There are hard transient events, is what we call them, things that are perceptually hard and things that are predictable and soft over time. And so what we're doing actually isn't anything mathematically similar to the, academic morphological component analysis, but the idea was inspired by it. So
very cool.
The idea at the time was just really, can we do this to audio? We started there, and we didn't really answer the question, what's it good at, until we could do it first. So
that's how real scientists work, right?
Yeah. It was really just, it became kind of like this, well, we're paying this guy, and and so he and a DSP engineer at the time, Dan, and myself, and Dan's gone on to start his own company, who we distribute plugins for, Newfangled Audio. The three of us worked together and had at least two different methods to do this. And eventually we honed in on one because it was both working well enough and also like feasible, as in it wouldn't take like 100% of your CPU to do the thing. So that was kind of where it came from. It's just, can we do this?
I love that idea of taking ideas from other disciplines like photography, seeing what kind of development they're able to do there, and can we take some of that effect and apply it to audio. I think it's a cool kernel in there.
Obviously, this is Russell's baby, and he's been thinking about this, but I kind of look at this in a different way. If I hear a sound, I can hear, it has some high frequency components, it has low frequency components, and I know I could play with that. If I hear a sound, I can hear if it has some ambience, and I've been able to play with that. And if I hear a sound, I could also perceive that there's a transient and a tonal quality to that sound. But the notion of actually splitting a signal up effectively always seemed like a bit of a stretch to me. So from my perspective, I knew this was going on. It seemed exciting, but I wasn't sold on it until Russell was able to demonstrate that he could accomplish this. He could take a sound that I was hearing and split it up in such a way that, yes, if I listen to the transient part, that's what I was hearing. Listen to the tonal part, that's what I was hearing. And then he could put those pieces back together and get the original sound. That was the magic. Putting it back together without losing anything. That seemed to be the magic trick. So that's when I was sold on it. And then once you can look, if we can perceive parts of a sound, wouldn't it be great if we can manipulate each piece? So it just seemed impossible to do.
Yeah. Well, now that it's done, what were some of the first applications that made you guys say, whoa, this idea has some merit to it. We can actually get cool sounds out of it. It's not just cool in theory, but here's a cool sound that we couldn't have achieved before.
I felt like it was really effects forward at the time. A really great application in Fission is reverb, right? So when you're designing reverbs, you're always struggling with the trade-off between echo density and modal density. And different reverbs have different applications for different signals. If your signal tends to be very transient heavy, it might sound pretty okay with something with a lot of echo density, right? But if you design a reverb with a lot of modal density, at least a standard parametric reverb, you end up with a lot of echoes, right? Because it's modally. It's this fundamental trade-off in the universe, and it frustrates all of us that you can't have great resolution in both time and frequency.
You're talking over some of our heads here, so I want to get real quick. I'll boil it down. Echo versus modal density. This is probably not a way that a lot of non-programmers think about their reverb. So,
this is the way maybe some acousticians and room designers and stuff think about reverb. It's okay. Let's think about this. Like,
not the average practitioner. They're like, I just figured out what pre-delay does. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, pre-delay is kind of a fake thing too, right? You've been in a big non-diffuse room. Think of like a tiled hall or something, right? Where there's nothing, just a ton of echoes, and if that thing gets bigger, you can hear those as discrete echoes, right? Instead of like or go clap in a really terrible hallway, you'll hear the flutter, right? And so the idea that we can design a specific reverb for the transient signal that focuses on the time domain echoes more. And then once we know that we have in the tonal signal where it's all steady state and predictable, we know we don't have these sharp attack signals. We can focus in on designing a reverb that sounds really good for that, right?
Right.
So that was one of the first practical applications that I heard in Fission. Another one in Fission is chorus. Like if you notice, like a lot of chorus pedals, you get a good chorus sound you like. But you if you slap that thing, you'll hear like you'll hear some delay line echoes because you've increased the size of the chorus to get some really nice sort of seasicky washy stuff or whatever. But
so you could now add that kind of chorus to just the sustain without worrying about triggering that fluttering, and then do a lighter, more gentler chorus to the initial transient, or nothing at all to the initial transient.
Same thing with tremolo. It's an even easier example. Maybe I started with the hardest one. Whatever. It's the most interesting one to me.
Yeah. Well, that's probably why. Cool. So I think these are some great applications. I think there's also some interesting stuff there with compression is slightly more of a utility where you're just controlling transients, and maybe there being new ways to approach compression and limiting. But that leads us a little bit more in the utility direction, which I think the SplitEQ is a little different for a lot of Eventide plugins, where often you guys are known as an effects company that makes far out effects. But the SplitEQ is meant to be less like that. Could you tell us a little bit about it? And then we'll bring it up on screen for people so that they can see it, get a look at the GUI. And soon we're going to do a demonstration video where you can hear some of this stuff in action in both subtle and radical settings, in mixing, in mastering, and in all sorts of contexts. So look for that video coming on this channel very shortly. So before we get into that, Russell, give us the idea, and Tony and Peter, if you like, give us the idea behind what you're trying to achieve with SplitEQ. Then maybe we can take a look at the basic controls that are on it.
Well, what we're trying to achieve is simply a better EQ. The parametric EQ is 50 years old, and there really haven't been any any real significant advances. I mean, it's been perfected. The first parametric EQs were built with analog components. They all had a flavor, a color. I mean, now they're in the digital realm. You could make pretty much perfect filters. So the parametric EQ at this point is pretty much as good as it's going to get. So what can you do beyond that? So we think we've built, world-class parametric EQ that breaks into a new dimension.
And what are some of the things that you think you can achieve with SplitEQ that wouldn't be possible in a normal parametric EQ? What are some of the applications for it?
Well, it's not just what's not. Well, we can talk about that, but it's not just that. It's also when you use if you use a traditional EQ, you're affecting all of the sound at that frequency. So being able to selectively just act on the part of the sound that either you're trying to emphasize or you're fixing a problem, that's the sibilance, or I don't know, maybe Peter, you can talk about an application.
Yeah. I think in some ways its closest analog is a dynamic EQ. As far as like a dynamic EQ is level dependent, right? It's looking at the sound and that's going to affect how much EQ you get. And a lot of split EQ, if you think about it kind of in terms of EQ and compression, I think that's helpful. It's not a compressor for sure. I think the way you can process transients with the compressor, right, is level dependent. So it has to be in some relationship to this threshold. You don't get anything until it's above the threshold, then you start compressing, right? And the same thing kind of applies with dynamic EQ, where you have some sort of level threshold and you're doing something when when you cross that threshold. So the downside about that is it's also level dependent, right? If you have a signal that's going up and down, you might not ever cross that threshold, or like you won't get the same thing for soft versions of the timbre that you would for louder ones. Something that has a huge dynamic range, you're gonna get pretty different EQs on the soft parts versus the loud parts. But if you think about the way we hear, you can hear a soft transient, right, and recognize, that this real soft is the same thing as, that.
Or a good example is the initial crack of a snare, but then the rattle of the snare wires on the bottom of the drum. Those are transient events, right?
Yeah.
They're quieter than the initial crack. The resonance of the snare drum is the stable tonal signal.
Yeah, or if the drummer switches to brushes.
Or just brushes, brushes are transient events.
Yeah, and if we're thinking of the drums, the kick drum, so you have a kick drum that's really boomy. So, you go to 60 hertz, you pull down some of the energy at 60 hertz, and sure, it gets rid of the boom, but with split EQ, you can just do that to the tonal portion and not the thump. So you still get the attack of that, the pedal hitting the skin, but the boominess is gone, just the boominess. So, the way I look at it is, it's a tool that helps you avoid unintended consequences. I'm looking at, since I've been playing with split EQ, I'm looking at all other EQs as kind of blunt instruments. Where you're affecting all of the sound, whether you want to or need to or not. We've had some early users talk about, improving sibilance, especially, poorly recorded, bad mic placement, and, being able to bring down the sibilance. And the way it was described to me is, hey, I was able to get rid of that nasty sibilance, but keep the sheen. Now, I'm not sure what sheen means, but he was happy.
Sounds nice.
So I'm happy. Yeah.
Russell, can we see this thing by chance? Cool stuff. So we have a good look here now of the actual GUI itself, and it looks like a familiar interface for a lot of people. You're going to be familiar with this if you've used a GUI before, but I'm getting the feeling that green and blue are very different. So green is the transient aspect of the signal, and blue is the tonal aspect of the signal. And it looks like you also have the ability to pan and control level independently for both of these. And another really cool thing that you guys have here that I'm seeing is that you have an EQ scale. I love EQ scale controls that are independent for both. So you can set in a pretty radical EQ setting for just your transient and then scale it down, say for just the tonal. So I imagine there's a linking functionality where I could create one EQ for both, figure out, hey, I don't want to apply this significant of an EQ to the tonal and maybe just scale that down. Is that a kind of workflow I could adopt?
Yeah, so I mean, you can kind of see we've added some key shortcuts here. You can reset stuff to 0 by option click on a Mac. But yeah, so if I want to like boost this particular region here with a peaking filter, but I realize that I don't want to do it to the tonal signal, I can just grab the little blue tab, which matches tonal here. Maybe do a little less or take it all the way down. I can do stuff like shift drag to have alternate cues on the two different signals, like that. And then if at any time I want to link them back up, I just double click one of them and they pulls them back together.
Oh, very cool.
So it's kind of all, once you learn a couple of, they're very similar mouse key commands to EQs, or parametric EQs, right? Just added this linking feature here. So these stay linked in frequency because we discovered through a lot of workflow research that's what most, users were liking, that these filters are kind of like tracking each other in frequency, but we can change the gain and the Q independently. And so that goes for all your major filter types besides the cuts. So the low shelf, the peak, the notch, the high shelf, we have a tilt shelf, and the bandpass are all frequency linked between the tonal and the transient sides.
And then what about your low cut and high cut filters? How do those work?
Those since those don't really have any notion of gain, right? They can have independent cues, right? And also independent frequency. So this makes a lot of sense if you want to really cut just the tonal side of something really, really boomy, like really drastically cut it, but keep that transient thumped, right?
Totally. Yeah, that harkens back to what Tony was talking about with kick drums. I really like that idea of having a separate low roll-off for each. And I could see the exact same kind of thing with the filters on the high frequencies of having a low-pass filter where you could maybe get rid of some sibilance while keeping sheen, I think was the words that you used, Tony. But it's making more and more sense to me now that I'm kind of seeing the graphical layout. Now, one application here that doesn't immediately make sense to me, but I would love to hear where people have found this useful, is that you can pan independently your transient and sustained signals. Where has this been useful to people?
Well, I should say we are known for effects.
Yeah,
this was me. So I pushed for this back when this didn't look like a plugin and it was just a bunch of really ugly sliders, like 40 of them on a page, and I was experimenting with what panning looks like on EQs, and I realized that I could take something like a mono recording of a drum set, and with the EQ and the panning, I could make it sound like that thing was mic'd up with stereo mics, because I can move transients around separately than tonal signals. And then I realized on acoustic guitar recordings, I can make it sound like I had two mics because I could just kind of frequency based pan some of the transients one way ever so slightly and the tonal the other way. And it was getting to some interesting, extreme. It sounds like an effect. It's kind of strange to hear a guitar where all the strums are on the left and and the resonance is all on the right. That's an interesting sort of mixing effect.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some people will take a spaced pair approach to miking acoustic guitar, where you have one mic kind of pointing more towards the bridge, one pointing more towards the fingerboard, and I can imagine this kind of recreating that effect. And it can be startling spread that might not always work in the context of a dense mix, but if the acoustic guitar is a featured element and meant to take up a lot of space and feel a little more kind of otherworldly and have an almost natural chorus that you can't put your finger on, and I could imagine this having a similar effect. So that seems like a cool application.
Yeah, I've seen people using the panning for sort of featured effects where they'll kind of pan like an ambient guitar tone in interesting ways. Things like that. So,
and there's also some repair uses for it too, with room acoustics. We had an engineer who was having a lot of problems with, I think, was it the hi-hats pulling or something? He had some recording where he had some transients in a place that were kind of shifting the stereo image in a way he didn't want. It's either the transients, I think it was the transients, and he was able to pull them back, and he was just like, wow, this is something that's it's a complete pain to deal with, and I did it like nothing. So yeah, there's
one of the interesting things if you do something and you really to fix it and you really got some interesting things going on here, and you can feel the whole signal pulling left or right. We included this sort of master panner to maintain the relationship here, but then pull the signal back to where it feels balanced, right? So
Now, the last thing in here that's leaping out at me that might not be a familiar control to most people is there's this transient section at the bottom where it says separation, decay, and smooth. And this is something I believe that was there on Fission as well. This, I imagine, is controlling how much the transient is separated from the tonal signal. Can you give us a sense of how to use those and why?
Yeah, so it's a little, we updated it from Fission a bit, actually, because Fission has this idea of a, what do we call that control, guys?
Focus.
Focus, thank you. But that was more, you could see the two streams, so you'd be focusing the split into one channel or the other. And since this one's more about to what degree are we separating the transients and what's the tail on them. So transient separation, if you could kind of think of it as you pull up the transient separation, it's really tightening in on the transient events, right? Putting more energy into the stable side of the signal, right? So as you turn that up, you're going to get a bigger signal in tonal than you are transient, but your transient's going to be really tight and focused, right? And then if you want to kind of like give that a little bit relief just on the back end, we add some decay to the transients to kind of let them breathe on the back side in time.
Right. If you think about a multi-band compressor where there's like a crossover point where some of the each band is shared across two different processors, is that kind of thing going on with transient EQ, or is it just totally separate that we're affecting only transient, or is there some spill from one to the other with the effect that we're applying?
There's some spill from one to the other, but that would happen in a crossover filter too. Right. Those typically overlap.
Yes.
And I think it's an analogy that works. Just take that, little one-dimensional picture and turn those two, what do we want to call those? Like bands, frequency band humps. Make those three-dimensional, right? And there's a bunch of them. So they're more like buckets, right? The analogy is similar.
Yeah, it's a crossover in the time dimension instead of the frequency dimension. Wild.
Well, it's in both dimensions. Yeah. It's in time frequency.
Very cool.
Yeah, we've been struggling to come up with terms to describe this darn thing. So, but it is adding a dimension.
I mean, the other thing I wanted to say about the time controls, like smoothing and decay, is if you do think about it as a sound goes from transient to tonal, as many sounds do, by affecting the rate that those can change back and forth, you're kind of effectively altering how quickly one EQ curve becomes the other, but all along it. So those are independent events. They're not, unlike a dynamic EQ, it would all be kind of like happening within this band, and all of these frequencies are doing the same thing. That's not really the case with SplitEQ. You've got thousands of little subdivisions of the spectrum, and each one is, doing its own thing.
I think we're starting to risk going into territory where we are finding out about the inner workings of this EQ, which is awesome. But I know, Peter, that what people want right now is to try this thing out for themselves and say, can I make it do weird stuff? So go to Eventide.com.
Not weird stuff. Can you make it do useful stuff? And, what we did was we've put a lot of time and energy into creating presets to make this tool easy to use. And we probably should, I think it's important to mention that.
So what are a couple of the presets in there that you guys think are going to be most useful to people?
Well, they're purpose built, fixing that kick drum boom, fixing sibilance.
Yeah, I mean, we have 4 different categories. We've got repair, rebalance, enhance, and widen. And so we've got, for a variety of instruments, we have, for example, on vocals, for repair, we have control the Bs, control the S's, plosive reduction, unmasking vocal highs, unmasking vocal mids, vocal intelligibility, all sorts of different presets. And then we have quite a few different options for drums. So we definitely provided quite a few options for vocals, drums, and guitar, especially. We just, those are all tricky things to get right in a mix. And so we really wanted to make it as practical as possible, and so that users could really just kind of, batteries included kind of approach.
I love that. And I think some of those presets are going to help teach people how to use their plugin for themselves and start off on the right foot with it. So I'm excited to try this out for myself. I'm going to be doing a demo video on this. I'm going to try it in both mixing and mastering context, and I'll report back with where I find it the most useful. I'm really excited to try it out. If these people want to try it out for themselves, can they do that over at eventideaudio.com? Is that the best place to try this stuff out? You guys do have a demo period?
30-day free
30-day free trial.
Nice. 30 days, try it out, become addicted to it, and become like Tony, and you'll never go back to a normal EQ. You'll say, what is this brute tool?
Blunt.
Who handed me this stone hammer?
I didn't say brute. I said blunt. A brute tool.
Fair enough. I was trying to make it sound even worse.
Yeah.
Well, guys, really fascinating. It is a new class of effects that is still, like, I think, a sleeper hit waiting to happen. I know that there are people who have not tried Fission because they don't know how it's going to fit into their workflow. And I know people who have tried it and say, wow, that's cool. There's literally no other tool where I can do these specific things. And I like the idea where you're taking it out of the world of effects and into the world of both. You can do some crazy effecty stuff, but you can also do subtle surgical fixes that were impossible before and are still impossible even with just dynamic EQ. And it seems like another leap forward, another dimension in which to use EQ. So really, really exciting stuff. Well, thank you guys for joining us. What are the best places for people to keep up with Eventide and what's going on with it? If they're into the social media and the following, are there places where you guys are most active online?
We don't know.
Should we call in
We need a marketing person.
I will research that
I think we have
myself
all
and
the
we'll
stuff.
put it below on the screen right here.
Yeah.
I think we even have TikTok now, don't we?
We have TikTok now. I think, we do.
Nice. I'd love to see you, Steve. You're going to do some karaoke for us on TikTok later?
I don't think so.
All right. Maybe one of these days.
Yeah, we have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok.
We have a website.
Our website. We have, if you want to get emails, you can sign up for our email list. We're pretty much out there like everyone else at this point.
Well, thank you guys for hanging out with us and taking us for a walk through this tool. Really exciting. Really excited to try it for myself. You guys try it out for yourselves over at eventideaudio.com, where you can try out this or anything else they make for free for apparently 30 days, which is super generous. Not every plugin company is going that long. So definitely check it out. And if you do try it, let us know in the comments down below. What were some of your favorite applications? Were there any presets in there that were particularly useful for you? How did you find using this stuff on your end? Thanks again for hanging out with us. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop with the folks from Eventide. Thank you guys for joining us.
Justin. Thank you, Justin.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah. Thank you for hanging out with us. See you next time.